Welcome to the second lecture video on the endocrine system. This one will be pages 623 to 629 in your textbook. As you can see from the title, we will be covering 5 different endocrine glands: the pineal, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, and pancreas. If we go right into the outline, it's essentially self-explanatory. The section in this book is actually called Other Endocrine Glands because it comes after the hypothalamus and pituitary. I will cover each of these in order, talking about the anatomy for each one, and then a little bit about the hormones that each of these glands secretes. So let's jump right into the first gland, the pineal gland. This is located in the brain, in the hypothalamus, and the hormone it secretes is probably familiar to most of us. It's called melatonin. It seems to be involved in setting our circadian rhythms and perhaps sexual maturation. There's strong evidence for that in animals, maybe less so in humans because it's harder to do the research. The pineal gland is quite large when we are children and ages 1 through 5, but after that, its size really declines until by the end of puberty, it's only about 1/4 the size as it was during childhood. We know that this is, or we think this is somehow involved in circadian rhythms because we know there are neurons from the eye, from the optic nerve. As they bring impulses to the brain, there are also some connections through the spinal cord, actually, into the pineal gland. And so there seems to be some information coming into the pineal gland about the amount of light that's available, whether it's day or night. In fact, during the evening, the pineal gland synthesizes and secretes melatonin, and its levels in the blood peak about 3 to 5 hours after we start to sleep. Our next gland is the thyroid gland. This gland sits on the anterior portion of our throat. It's sort of a butterfly-shaped and wraps around the front of the trachea, just below the voice box or your larynx. If we look at the microscopic anatomy of the thyroid, this is shown in panel B on the right in this pink color. First, we will see the most obvious structures, and these are called follicles. And these are these large spheres. And there will be hundreds of these in the thyroid gland. They are filled with a material called colloid. Colloid is like a gelatinous material, and this one is called thyroglobulin. And the thyroglobulin is what is produced by the cells that line the inside of each follicle. These are called follicular cells. Sometimes you'll see them called follicle cells. They produce the thyroglobulin, which then becomes the precursor for thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, abbreviated TH, comes in basically 2 flavors. 90% of it is what we would call T4, also called thyroxine or tetraiodothyronine. And the other 10% is called T3 or triiodothyronine. The T3 and T4 get their names because the molecules have either 3 or 4 iodine atoms on them. So this is an important mineral when it comes to endocrinology, because the thyroid gland actually collects our iodine and uses it then to make thyroid hormone. Now, of course, thyroid hormone, I've mentioned before, is responsible for setting the basic metabolic rate in the body. The thyroid gland also secretes a second hormone. This one is called calcitonin, and it's secreted by the C cells, also called the parafollicular cells. Notice that these sit outside of the follicles and therefore have a separate function than thyroid hormone itself. So let me back up a little bit here and say these follicle cells or the colloid, these are the source, the follicles of TH, thyroid hormone, and the C cells or the parafollicular cells, these are the source of calcitonin. Calcitonin is involved in calcium homeostasis. It helps to lower blood calcium by stimulating the osteoblast activity. We talked about this in AMP1 when we were talking about bones. So it will stimulate osteoblasts to lay down more bone and promoting calcium deposition in the bone rather than leaving it in the blood. Our next gland is the parathyroid, or I should say are the parathyroid glands. There are usually 4 of these, and they sit on the posterior aspect of the thyroid. So these are quite small, and you can see in this figure, this is figure 17.10, we're looking at a posterior aspect basically of the throat. So at the bottom here we can see there's the trachea, and just posterior to the trachea is the esophagus, and so right about the same depth as the esophagus we can see our 4 parathyroid glands. I'll circle these in red. And the hormone that's secreted by the parathyroid glands is a pretty easy one to remember because it's called parathyroid hormone. And the abbreviation for this is just PTH. Parathyroid hormone is involved in calcium homeostasis, but it does the opposite of calcitonin. It raises blood calcium levels by activating osteoclasts, and so it will release calcium into the blood, and by also instructing the kidneys to hold on to more calcium rather than losing it in urine. Interestingly, the parathyroid glands were not known and were only discovered after surgeons would perform thyroid surgeries, and the patients would then suddenly die, and they realized, oh, there must be something else involved here, and so then they discovered that the parathyroid glands that they were removing were actually causing this trauma. Our 4th gland is the adrenal gland. We have 2 of these, one on each kidney. They sit right on top of the kidneys. And what we're showing here is figure 17.11 in your book. The adrenal gland has 2 portions, the cortex, which is the outer portion, and the adrenal medulla, which is the inner portion. As you'll see, this is the most detailed of the discussions of all the glands that we're going to do today, because each of these sections of the adrenal gland essentially acts like 2 separate glands. They secrete very different types of hormones and are controlled differently as well. Let's start with the adrenal medulla, and this secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, and I'll abbreviate these as epi and NE. Epinephrine constitutes about 75%, maybe 80% of the secretions of the adrenal medulla. The other 25% or so is norepinephrine. And as our book points out, there's also just a dash of dopamine as well. But functionally, we look at epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are the stress hormones. They are also called the fight or flight, part of the fight or flight response. These are released when we are stressed or afraid or anxious, and they cause all kinds of reactions that will enable us to better perform activity or exercise. So they increase the heart rate, increase the amount of glucose in the blood, and get ready for our muscles to utilize fats. And they cause us to start sweating. So all of these things that would get us ready for physical exertion. We can even see some of the maladaptation, such as when you are nervous or anxious in an exam, and your heart rate increases and you start sweating even though you will just be sitting there the whole time. For the discussion of the adrenal cortex, I'm going to jump ahead to the next figure. This is still figure 17.11, but panel B. And we can see the different layers of the cortex, as well as the medulla. That's the middle part. The adrenal medulla is down here in this panel number 4. And let's first off check the anatomy of the cortex. At the very top of this figure is the connective tissue capsule. That's sort of the outer lining. And then if we go from the outer towards the inner, we have 3 main layers of the cortex. The first one is the zona glomerulosa. The second one is the zona fasciculata. And the third one is the zona reticularis. They are named by the appearance of their cells. The glomerulosa, the term glomerulus means like a tuft or a clump of cells, and that's what those look like. They have the appearance of round clusters. The fasciculata, the term comes from the term fascicle, which looks like a bundle, and these cells look like they're lined up in vertical rows to form these bundles. A reticularis is a network or a net, and these look like they form a branching network of cells. Now let's take a look at what each of these zones actually does. The zona glomerulosa secretes hormones that are called mineralocorticoids. You'll see this term corticoids quite a bit. That just refers to the cortex. Mineralocorticoids, the most common one is aldosterone. And aldosterone is a hormone that is secreted when blood pressure drops or when we are dehydrated. It instructs the kidney to hold on to sodium. Rather than lose sodium in urine, it puts sodium back into the blood, and that actually helps to retain water because water follows salt. So it will maintain sodium and water content. Both the zona fasciculata and the zona reticularis secrete hormones called the glucocorticoids, as well as androgens or the sex steroids. And again, that's for both zona fasciculata and zona reticularis. For the glucocorticoids, the most common one is cortisol, but we also secrete one called corticosterone. You guys have heard about these corticosterols or glucocorticoids. They're often as shots to patients because they have an anti-inflammatory effect. Hydrocortisone shots would be a really common one because they relieve swelling, get you back on the field sooner. The glucocorticoids, they stimulate protein and fat breakdown and a process called gluconeogenesis, the making of new glucose. And these are going to act as fuels for muscles during exercise. And so these are also activated by stress, just like the adrenal medulla is. The release of glucocorticoids will be stimulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary. Androgens are also secreted by both the zona fasciculata and zona reticularis. These are the sex steroids. The most common one is called DHEA, and that's dihydroepiandrosterone. It doesn't have much activity by itself, but tissues can absorb it and then enzymatically turn it into testosterone. So in males, this will not be a large form or a large source of the androgens that will be mostly from the testes, but in females, this will be the source for androgens. Estradiol is also secreted by the adrenal cortex, and just like, I suppose this would be opposite of the androgens, then in males, this will be the main source of any estrogens, but however, in females, the estrogens will mostly come from the ovaries. For our final gland, let's go to the pancreas. This is figure 17.12 in your textbook, and we can see the diagram in panel A here on the left. The pancreas sits right next to the opening portion of the small intestine, the initial portion of the small intestine. Not shown on here is the stomach, and the stomach would be right over here somewhere, and the liver is going to be right here. And so the pancreas is sort of tucked in underneath these two digestive organs, and then also surrounded by the rest of the small intestine as it curls around our abdomen. Interestingly, of the gross anatomical structures we can see here in the pancreas and the small intestine, these have to do with digestion, and so you can see that the pancreas will secrete actually enzymes down the pancreatic duct and right here, and they will enter the small intestine to help digest the food that we've just eaten as it enters the small intestine from the stomach. However, we are interested in the endocrine portion of the pancreas, and so if we look at this little box here that we've enlarged, we can see the structures that are called pancreatic islets, and that's here, pancreatic islet. There's another one shown here on the right side in panel C. These used to be called islets of Langerhans, with a capital L because it was named after the person who discovered them. But you'll see a trend in almost all of the structures we're going to look at in naming anatomical structures. We are trying to name them now after either their appearance or their location rather than someone's name. So this gives us a better idea of what they actually do. So pancreatic islets is the new name. The two important cell types we can see in here are the beta cell and the alpha cell. The beta cell secretes insulin, and the alpha cell secretes glucagon. So these are important in maintaining a normal blood glucose level. Insulin, when it is released after we eat a meal, will be secreted in response to rising blood glucose, and it signals tissues such as adipose tissue and muscle to take up glucose out of the blood, so therefore blood glucose drops. Glucagon, on the other hand, is activated by low blood glucose. It will signal the liver to release glucose into the blood when blood glucose starts to drop. Say this happens overnight, of course, when we go 6 or 8 or 10 hours without eating anything, our blood glucose levels will drop, but the liver, in response to glucagon, will keep it at a normal level. So that concludes the video for this second set of reading. For next lecture, go ahead and read pages 623 to 629. That will cover what I just went over. And then a sort of the guiding question to get you through this. Keep track of the secretions and their functions and the stimuli for release for these hormones of all of these different glands. Finally, a set of vocabulary words to be familiar with. A good idea to go over these as well. So that concludes the video. We'll see you next time.